just going to dive right in since there was a few minutes delay. Seeing some awesome people over here, friends, family, uh, distant relatives. Uh, okay, so this is a bit of an interesting experiment and like a new format that we're trying out. This is effectively like me sort of showing you guys like what our internal process is like as we have been having these like debates and lively discussions about the meaning of the new Clarity Act and the Crypto Market Structure Act, and obviously wanting to participate in all of the great discussion that we've been seeing all across crypto Twitter. So in fact, like I was joking with some of the others internally, like we've never seen so much, reaction to corporate structuring and the like. So as you guys maybe know, when you guys ask me a question, like the format of this thing is really aimed at like not necessarily like the founder who has never heard of these concepts, but really at like the GC, the lawyer, the longtime industry practitioner. And oftentimes when you guys like ask me a question, what's really happening in my head is I'm thinking like, okay, what would Chad do? What would Sean think? How would Rebecca react to this? Each of whom are specialists in and experts in crypto securities and litigation and tax matters. So just to briefly introduce them in case you haven't ever met them, and certainly it's a rare treat to have literally all three of them on at the same time. It's kind of aligned at the stars here. We've got Sean McElroy, who teaches crypto tax at Stanford. Rebecca Matsumura, who was on the Ripple litigation defense team before joining us at Fenwick, and Chad Richman, who was formerly general counsel at Center, which is the consortium that launched USDC with Circle and Coinbase. So, so kind of without further ado, the way we were thinking to kick it off was to just put ourselves in the mind space of what would 2026 look like in terms of structuring. Like, Chad, you've been watching the industry for so long. You have no doubt been waiting for this moment for many, many years. What would it be like to have national legislation? What is the world going to be like? Over to you, Chad.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean it's a fun thought exercise, right? I mean, obviously we don't know if any of the what bills are going to pass, and for sure, like if they do pass, the language will change between now and then. So I think like honing in on any particular like nuance of statutory interpretation is premature, but I do think we have some broad strokes about what is being discussed in Congress and being discussed in the federal government generally. Um, for one, I mean, there's one big thing is to just say it's super exciting because I think like this industry has survived under conditions of like deep legal uncertainty for a long time. And while have been a lot of amazing things to come out of that over the years, and some of what is cool in crypto has been building resilience to legal uncertainty. At the same time, there's some business models, there's some token structures, there's some participants who just like the level of uncertainty just doesn't work. Like they can only thrive under more certain conditions. So I'm excited about that. Um, but yeah, I think to me the two big shifts, and there's a lot going on in the Clarity Act. It's like 200 plus pages long, but like there's the to me in terms of thinking about like new token project is going to be structured. Like the two really big changes are one, it has like an affirmative incentive through providing a special securities registration exemption that's only available to US issuers and of new digital commodities. And that is like that's in a way a huge sea change in all of securities law where normally these registration exemptions that can be used to conduct private sales of securities and or have private exemptions are available to every issuer regardless of their jurisdiction. So like one question is, and we'll talk more about this, like is there going to be this big new incentive to locate a global project in the United States? And two is maybe getting away from the Howey test, right? Like everyone who's been in this industry for any length of time at all knows that, it creates a big problem if your token is treated as a security. And so you have to like, you have to structure your activities to be within this very this very flexible test, which does not provide a lot of uncertainty and focuses a lot on like what you're allowed to what types of relationships are allowed to exist, what types of promises are allowed to be made um by the founders, but what types of efforts can be going on in terms of the value of the token. And having a test that is different from that could open up a lot of different like business models that are just not haven't been possible for a long time.
And if I'm like just sort of just generally kind of deriving like a vibe check from that on both points, we're excited. I mean, it is exciting for US based entrepreneurs and US based capital formation to occur in the United States on your first point. And secondly, to unleash, I'll just speak for maximal effect, unleash the efforts of others. I know that each of Sean and Rebecca are going to have like very strong like reactions and interest points on both of those points. So I kind of, maybe Sean, we'll start with you about like, US based and entirely US based activity in respect to like, selling tokens. How are you thinking about all this?
Well, thanks, Chris. And the first thing I would say is that with tax, it's never going to be entirely US based. It's always going to be a web of crypto is a very international space, and nothing is ever going to be totally US based or totally international. It's always going to be using international from the US law perspective, but it's always going to be multinational efforts and figuring out really how projects can interact with the various tax regimes of which they are a part. So I think we will see, with the things that Chad and Rebecca are talking about here, we're going to see more and more opportunities for people to be in the United States, to be doing these projects in the United States. And that's going to require, from a tax perspective, thinking about how to do that in a way that will give projects the flexibility and help them really meet their business objectives, whether it's foreign investment or US investment, whether it's selling tokens in the US market or in foreign markets, and then kind of thinking through those questions. So I think this is really an opportunity, but what I'm thinking about is what are these structures going to look like, not just in the next year as these build up, but how are these structures going to look 5 years from now or 10 years from now when they've been built out? And these are multinational structures and have evolved into a mature ecosystem. And the startups of today become the big companies of tomorrow. I mean, really the biggest multinational companies in the world. So that's how I'm thinking of this, is this long perspective. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, one of the things that folks have been asking me about, and that is maybe kind of like you're alluding to, is like with this, especially with a huge rush to re-domicile everything, like just like fully just like take the bathwater and put it entirely back into the bath with the baby. So is it possible that we're concerned that like literally, the initial premise of Web3, like all of these users from all around the world are going to be suddenly subjected to the US tax regime, where that's likely, are you suggesting maybe like not fully thought through?
Well, so there's kind of two questions I take from that. The first question is really, what does it mean to, and I think we'll get into that a bit later about re-domiciling assets and what that can mean and what kind of that interaction with international and US domiciling of assets can mean there, Chris. But ultimately, I think that US law has never, I always like to make the joke, there's plenty of US law about crypto, tax law about crypto. There's also no US tax law about crypto. You have the existing web of 100 years of tax law where you can kind of figure out how all this fits in, but there is no rule where you can look it up and say, what will a crypto foundation, how will it be taxed in the US? How will crypto projects be taxed in the US? How does this work? I can't point you to specific line item rules in the tax code that will say that. There just isn't that. So we have to look back to the history of tax law and build out examples of that, of how that will work. I think there will be paths. I think there are ways that this will all make sense. I think the tax law will not be an impediment to people being inside the US and carrying out operations within the US, but it's something that you have to be careful about and think about and be conscious about. The other thing I would say is just, it's really, once you come into the US, it is very difficult and impossible to go out. This is really a one-way thing. We saw this so I'm going to talk totally non-crypto for a second, but with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there was a major incentive built in to have IP in the United States. So major multinationals repatriated IP to the United States, knowing that that was a one-time move. You cannot move IP outside the United States and not pay major U.S. tax consequences, and potentially make it impossible from a tax perspective to do that. So here, if you're moving in the US, that will be possible. I really believe there will be opportunities and things, and that will become more possible potentially with legislation, potentially as we evolve more in the space to have US-based foundations, but you're not going to be able to go the other way. So that's something just to be conscious of when you have these very multinational regimes where you have people from all over the world engaging in all sorts of activity relating to this. If you want to be centered in the United States, once you do that, there is going to be a difficulty in going away from that. From the US government's perspective, that's great. You're in the US, we love that. We'll handle all of that. But it is just something that founders at an early stage need to be conscientious of, particularly founders that are not located in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to just be like Rebecca, go.
Yeah, just let me jump in on that last point as well, just from a litigation perspective. There's also, it's also equally true that once you start doing business in the United States and kind of engaging in that type of conduct in the United States, you're going to be subject to the jurisdiction of US courts. Right. And so another reason, kind of setting aside tax and other things like that, that folks like to organize activity outside of the United States that doesn't touch the United States directly, is to avoid our much more expensive and involved litigation process, right? And kind of stay in those countries' dispute resolution forums. And so another thing to think about, as projects are, thinking about repatriating, thinking about where they want to have a footprint is, what impact will that have? If they really are, if most of their users are overseas, if many of their users are overseas, if a lot of the folks who are involved in the project are overseas, like what is the impact on those people going to be if you end up getting held into US courts?
Yeah, and I was just going to jump in to say, like, I mean, from my like less expert, like just kind of like policy thought process, like if, again, back to Chad's like vibe check, like Chad, like if these bills efficiently achieve, I guess, what we're excited about, which is allowing US-based entrepreneurs and US-based investors to build projects and allow capital formation in the US, maybe like what the US is getting out of this is taxes and like and like a lot of incentives for teams to like move to the US and build. And maybe that's like part of the deal. What do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the things to call out is like if you look at these foundation structures that are used around the world by crypto projects, like there's some set of that which is like why a foundation separate from like like a for-profit entity, like why these non-commercial, non-shareholder vehicles. And then there's why outside the US. And I think the why outside the US in many cases was driven by the regulatory environment we've been in for a long time, for a variety of regulatory issues, from the SEC to money service business regulation to litigation planning, and then tax in some ways. I think like especially for and then tax. I think a lot of people consider that like by this point, so many people have like organized their activities outside the United States that they're accustomed to not having to be subject to U.S. tax, but also bristle at the compromises that means you have to make. Like if they bristle at the not being able to access a U.S. talent pool, not being able to access the U.S. markets, like having to, like that is some major sacrifices that come with that decision. And so I think the hardest part with this US incentive is really going to be for teams that are predominantly outside the US, whether they come inside the US where they otherwise like would never even touch the US market because of this particular security exemption. I think those are going to be some of the hardest conversations for like teams that have a heavy US presence for one reason or another. I think I can sort of see the trade-off being, there's going to be plenty of value to go around. They're happy for the government to get a cut, right? But
yeah, no doubt. And I know, and the people are wondering, and I know you're working on a ton of Dunas right now. This is for those teams that you just described, those kind of like high US Nexus teams. These Dunas seem to make a lot of sense, right? What's your experience with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a few different issues there, right? Like about like what the organizational structure should be. Like the foundation structures are trying to do a lot of different things at once right now. Like a lot of things as the industry has evolved, like the first foundations, were structured in this industry a decade ago. And as things have grown, like a lot of different responsibilities have been layered onto this foundation from like, oh, it's just going to deploy the protocol to, oh, it's going to conduct token sales to, oh, it's going to be like the wrapper for a DAO. And that's evolved over time. And I think one of the things that we may see is like the disaggregation of those things a little bit more. So like the Duna, very new, like not a lot of examples, very untested. But the thing that's really interesting about the Duna is around like token holder governance and how do you actually structure token holder governance to give the people participating in that governance like some limited liability protections and some legal certainty about where the assets are owned and how they can interact. And it is also like built very well. Like there's definitely some match between the sorts of structures that Duna allows and the types of things that like if the Clarity Act passes, will pass muster under like the definitions there about like what a decentralized governance system is supposed to look like. But then you also have the other element of what foundations were trying to achieve, which is separating like separating certain activities from like that are sort of only supposed to be for the benefit of like a token ecosystem rather than for the benefit of the shareholders of a for-profit entity, right? And so those are two different things, right? Like I wouldn't be surprised if there's a world where you still have foundations running grant programs and Duna's wrapping wrapping governance and figuring out some interactions between those entities. I can see that. And frankly, I also see a world like there's token holder governance itself, while it forms a part of a legal strategy, right? Like there's certainly like one of the cool things about crypto and amazing things about crypto is it allows these really low transaction cost ways of coordinating with people all over the world. And like many projects as part of their like as part of their like an originating vision of what this decentralized system they're trying to build looks like, there is a place for like crowdsourcing and community governance and community management. But there's also the fact that like many of the tests we've been dealing with in this, and this kind of goes to that second topic of like, is the Howey test changing? Like many of the ways we have applied the Howey test have been like, well, it would be great if someone would do this thing, but it can't be the team. Who could it be? Well, you say, oh, well, if there's an organization of token holders that gets together and like votes on it and elects someone and allocates some capital, it should be them. And end up with DAOs as a part of a legal strategy where sometimes maybe it's not the best fit. And so that, so I would be not surprised if we saw a world where there were sort of like, there were things that were intentionally designed to be run by the community and things that are not designed to be run by the community, and it's okay to have both.
Well, I know you're being cheeky because obviously, like many of our clients are literally talking to you about that right now. But I also know that Rebecca has some potentially spicy takes on whether Duna's. Look, Rebecca, you can dive in however you
no.
want.
Listen. I'm not trying to be controversial, but so one of the precipitating conversations that led us to this webinar and got this particular group of people together to chat at you guys for an hour was Chad and I kind of just sitting in our offices talking about Dunas, and one of the thoughts that I have approaching this from a litigation perspective is we really don't know how courts are going to react to the limited liability protection that the Duna statute provides. So usually when you think about the way that limited liability protections work in kind of, the statutes that create C Corps and create LLCs and create LLPs, there's a trade-off between giving control of the assets of the organization to that organization. And in exchange, you get the limited liability with respect to actions taken in respect of those assets, right? There's kind of this trade-off here. And the Duna doesn't really make that trade-off, right? At least potentially it couldn't. There's at least flexibility to create an organization and a DUNA where that trade-off isn't made, right? Because what you have instead of giving the idea is that you're still maintaining control of the corpus of assets, right? Which is probably going to be tokens in this case, with the members, right? With the token holders. But then trying to say that actions taken with respect to those assets are going to have this limited liability protection. This is completely untested, right? I mean, obviously, like DUNAs are very new, but even looking back at, before we had DUNAs, there was something called an UNA, which is an unincorporated nonprofit association, right? And that were things like church bowling leagues. And I actually kind of in preparation for this went back and looked, and there's very little case law kind of exploring the limits of limited liability protection for those types of organizations, which of course makes sense because they are, kind of these small scale organizations, not engaged in big, kind of economic activity. They don't have a lot of assets, but that's not what's going to be happening with the DUNA, right? Like these are going to be huge organizations that have an enormous amount of value that are in the United States, right? And crucially, I think that's this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? Like also the limited liability protection of a foreign foundation is untested. But they're a lot harder to serve, right? It's less likely to be tested. Whereas
that's a really good point, right? Like it's a huge point. They're both untested,
right?
But Rebecca, would you agree that if it works, it could be sweet because then you can get the entrepreneurs doing entrepreneurial activity, unleashing their efforts, and then over here is any liability which may well flow from like the thing that they've built, which is just autonomous.
Listen, like Chris and we've had this conversation enough that that I'm ecumenical, right? Like I want all of these things to succeed. I want everybody to have max options in the way that they organize their activity to pick the option that works best for what they're trying to build, right? But I think one aspect that hasn't been kind of underlined and talked about in the conversations on crypto Twitter and the kind of like lawyer group texts that we're all in is this risk of, this isn't something where, like with the foreign foundations, it's going to take a really special kind of facts to make somebody really want to try to serve somebody overseas and kind of go after those assets. Like this is going to be tested. And there's some limits to the DUNA that make it like, everybody remembers from law school, like bad facts make bad law. It's really easy to imagine the bad facts here, right? The DUNA doesn't require like a particular filing requirement. It doesn't require you to be in Wyoming, right? And so the kind of horrible thing that I'm imagining for the industry is that the first legal test we get of this is some DAO that's done something terrible, right? That's like stolen assets from their users, that's rugged everybody. And they, after the fact, say, oh, we're a DUNA, you can't come after us. They have no connection to Wyoming. They've never made this proclamation before, but like under the statute, like they have this argument. And you can see a court faced with facts like that, or even with facts that are a little bit less extreme saying, listen, I mean, a Wyoming court probably would be like, look, our hands are tied by our legislature, right? But like, is the Southern District of New York going to take that view? Is a New York court going to take that view? Is a Texas court going to take that view? Or are they going to say, no, you don't get to make that trade-off and start to kind of limit the way that the statute is applied?
I think that's a really good point too, because like one of the things, and to kind of synthesize your and Chris's point, is like, what does success for the DUNA look like? I mean, success for the DUNA looks like the opposite of that, which is test cases happening with very well structured, very competently like designed DUNAs that are going to hold up to scrutiny with like the right Wyoming contacts and like belt and suspenders on all of the different like places where we can see potential attacks. And then that being successful and then being replicated in other states. Because like, I mean, like, it's fun, Wyoming also the originator of the LLC, right? Like there used to be no LLCs. Wyoming came up with the LLC statute. There was a lot of litigation about whether you could have, these weird creatures that were like sort of like partnerships, but provided limited liability and like didn't really fit in the world of corporate governance exactly right. And now you've got LLC statutes in all 50 states and no one thinks twice about it. And it's just a normal part of life. So, I mean, there's a good story there too. Like, and so I think that's I think what you said is exactly right though, is like, they are the right tool for the job for some projects. If when we're working on it, it's going to be, hey, this is uncertain. It's not going to be something that's for people who are faint of heart, but we'll try, but we'll navigate those issues and try and put belt and suspenders on it and hope that if one of those DUNAs becomes a test case, it'll be a good test case, it'll be good facts, it'll make good law, and that would be great for the industry overall. But it's it's hard to control for everything.
But let's assume, and Miles just wrote that great article that generated so much discussion. Let's assume that everything that we're talking about here, the passage of clarity and the Crypto Market Structure Act, the Duna finds 49 other friends in every other state, and this all works exactly as hoped and dreamed. For maximal effect, will entrepreneurial efforts be unleashed? Is the question I pose, that the people want to know.
I think it
Becca,
depends.
I feel like you should take that one.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, like, I think this is going to be, the drum I'm going to be banging this whole time. And y'all have been listening to me complain about this for weeks, right? Like, there's no one answer, right? Like, I think that, like, building on something Chad said earlier, like, what's cool about crypto, what got me excited about crypto is the ability to organize things in all of these different and exciting ways that, allow us, a single kind of instrument to mediate relationships between people who would otherwise be shareholders, people who would otherwise be employees, people who would otherwise be early investors, people who would otherwise be, users and consumers, and kind of have everybody on an equal playing field and organize things that way. Sometimes that's going to look like, actually, we just want the efficiency of a centralized company. Right? That's what's most important for our project, and that's what we need to do. And that's going to give the maximum benefit for the project. But sometimes that's not going to work, right? And I think going back to, some of the discussion earlier about how, foundations, may still exist in this grant making capacity. One of the things that's cool about the kind of where the industry has landed right now is that we have things that would otherwise be happening, within the kind of closed confines of the politics of a C Corp, right? Which are like these small scale projects, right? Do they get funding? Does someone know the right person? Is it under the right manager? It's all happening out in the open, right? Where the users can ultimately kind of see it. And there's a much more kind of open discussion and marketplace of ideas about it. And I just don't think, like, I'm very resistant to this idea that we're going to get like one answer, one structure, kind of one thing that's going to work for everybody. I think, like, the area of creativity in crypto is not over, right? Like, we're gonna keep doing exciting things here.
And I'll just add a little point on that on the tax side, which is there are many structures in which people do any type of business from a tax perspective. And what a DUNA is not, and how it will evolve and how it's actually implemented will not necessarily be a one-size-fits-all tax answer for anything as well. Being dangerous, I'm going way back in history too, well before my time, but when the LLC came about, the LLC, there were a lot of questions of, is it taxed as a partnership or is it taxed as a corporation? And tax really divides things into flow through partnerships, disregarded entities, or regarded entities like corporations. And there was a whole bunch of back and forth. There were all these multi-factor tests until Congress came in and passed something, and it was actually Treasury passed a lot of this, called the check the box regulation. So the Treasury Department said you can elect whether you are a corporation or a partnership. So many of you who've worked on various startups or whatnot, you'll hear a check the box election and you'll make a decision for a foreign entity or a US entity how to treat it under tax law. It wasn't that way before 1997. It was a multi-factor test. Now, how will this fit into the check the box regime? Maybe it's very straightforward and you can just check the box on your DUNA or decide those are going to be big tax consequences, and tax planning, which is expressly allowed, like, you can choose whether to be a partnership or a corporation, depending on what helps you for tax purposes. The code has expressly blessed that for 100 years that you're able to do that. Courts have blessed that. You can make those choices. We do it all the time. Those are still going to be there. There's also going to be, I think, a question as I start to understand these entities more and how they're actually being implemented is, can you make a check the box election on them? Are they business operations or are they merely voting arrangements, or are that answer could be different as I understand it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Chad, but for different DUNAs could be different. You could have a DUNA that is purely a voting arrangement and not a controlling assets or not a business operation. You could have something that is a pure business operation. So those could impact the tax planning of these structures. And for me, that's something I find like really interesting about this, but you're going to have to be thinking and implementing these. It's not just, oh, it's like creating a C Corp and we know exactly what it is. There's going to be uncertainty that will evolve over time. And we're going to have to figure that out, because ultimately you're going to see a DUNA in tax court. And it could be DUNA and could be in tax court on a compensation issue or on something totally unrelated to the structuring. But how will courts look at that entity and treat that entity? I think that's going to be a big,
I just want to point out, hold up, Chad. This must be absolute torture. I just want to give a shout out to David Kerr in the audience, who's probably like, dude, I just wish I could just raise my hand and just start talking. We'll have to get David on as like a guest at some point. Anyway, Chad, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, to Sean, your point that you just made is like, it's a very flexible entity. You could use the DUNA statute to create something that looks very, like doesn't look like a DUNA, what people think of as at all. but it's flexible on the other side too, which is like like you really can, under the statute, assuming it works and holds up, it allows you to create this like decentralized entity that's very cool, right? You're not in the world anymore of like needing to have a board still when you like that's one of the frictions for anyone who's designed a DAO that uses a foundation is like what's going to be the relationship between the token holders and this board that has to be there by statute. But then to like Chris, your question about entrepreneurial efforts and Rebecca's point about like how things are going to look different. I mean, I often think back to some of the very first like SEC actions that were not fraud cases, but were like just pure failure to register cases, like Munchie, like those and like that era where people were talking about like the fat protocols thesis and all of that. And like it's not like we all as an industry figured out ways to do those things within the like legal framework. A lot of those models just went away and like those experiments never got tried. And because they sort of inherently included some period of time where there was going to be entrepreneurial efforts of others, and that like that was, even though the trajectory and the intent was this like decentralized system and like this technology, and there was an expectation too that even after you had that decentralized system, there were still going to be people around who had an economic interest in, number going up, for lack of a better term, and everyone had to like reorganize what this industry was and what kinds of things were being built and what kind of plans people were making away from those models. And so like there's so many experiments that just died on the vine. And now, of course, many years later, people are going to come up with all kinds of new things that no one ever thought of back then. But I think there's a lot of experimentation. Like I love, Rebecca, what you said, that like the era of experimentation in this industry is like not over. Like this is just be a whole new chapter, and will there's going to be things that none of us can expect right now that we're going to have to figure out like how to interact with what the rules are, and that's part of the fun. Like that's the exciting thing.
Can I ask, like, I mean, this is something that I'm just constantly getting texts and questions, and I've heard others opine on this, and I'm not even sure if we are able to at this point, if there's even enough information yet around this, what I'm about to ask. But so maybe we just got to punt. Can tokens be launched in the United States? It's crazy that this like remains like such an open question, right? Like as an industry, like all 60 of us on this line are just like, I don't know. I mean, like it, yeah.
Well, that's the nice thing about the framing of this webinar. What will it look like in 2026? I certainly hope so.
But I'm going to say this though, which is that tax is not going to be what stops this from happening. And that's a rare thing to totally say, but tax is not going to be a problem on this. I think there's a lot of potential tax good of launching tokens in the United States and creating property in the United States and disposing of that over time. That's, I think, the framework with which token launches and token holdings will have to be in the United States in the long run for tax purposes. For us, the launch of tokens in the US has obviously been impossible because of what Chad is talking about and kind of the regulatory side. I don't think that token launches being in the US has been stopped for tax purposes per se. Obviously, you have the tokens in the US and there's long-term tax consequences, but this is viable from a tax perspective to be able to do that.
And Sean, I mean, you punted on this earlier, so to later in the discussion, and I think maybe later has come. Like, what about the other end of the spectrum? Like, I think there's a lot of people who are probably wondering, oh man, we've got this token that we, that has a foundation and it's got a big treasury outside the United States. What's the best way to proceed? Like, how are you thinking about redomestication and what that might look like?
Yeah, so as I said, generally speaking, you can bring things back into the US. I think it's going to be the annoying answer is that it's fact contingent and it's kind of structure contingent on what that's going to look like. We've thought a lot about various ways that you could potentially do this. I ultimately think that the best answer here would be congressional action, would be to have a rule that would allow for a safe harbor of moving assets into the United States, or treasury action potentially I always am wary of Treasury authority to say things like that, but getting a safe harbor to move assets into the United States, that seemed, I mean, this, I could think of like, I don't know if there's any tax wonks on here, but the US did this in 2004 with Section 965 by allowing companies to repatriate cash at a very, very low rate in order to get cash in the US and reinvest it as part of George W. Bush's 2004 Tax Act. And a lot of money came into the United States. I think it was like Apple or somebody brought in just an enormous amount. There are opportunities to do that with crypto where, hey, if you bring your assets in, it's tax free or virtually no tax. You can do this in a safe harbor, have everything in the US and do that. That's going to be the safest route and what I would recommend the US government do. I do think there are ways for certain projects, depending on their structure, to be able to affect this in a tax efficient manner. Always happy to talk about that, but none of those are tested and they're very fact specific for what they do. But Fenwick does believe it's possible to do that, and we can think through how that would be.
Now I want to jump in and ask Chad the same question, just larger. Like what other things are you talking to people about who want to kind of repatriate into the United States, who want to start getting here now before we have the clarity of the Clarity Act?
Yeah, well, so I think this is where you know, getting into the actual details of the language is both an interesting and frustrating exercise, because we have a bill that's like not complete, that amendments are being made, that people are going to find. It's just amazing. You read something and you read it 3-4 times and you think you understand it, and then you actually have a real fact pattern in front of you, and you've got someone that says, okay, let's go through the exercise. What would we do if this became law tomorrow? And you're like, wow, it's really unclear. Like there's some and I'm hoping that some of those things get hammered out. But I think one of the biggest ones that we're talking about a lot is like, who is the issuer? And I think that there's this definition of issuer in the Clarity Act that includes potentially, many crypto projects have 3-4 entities that may be connected in relationships that are not, may or may not be connected by a control relationship, and so there's a question of, well, are they all the issuer? And if the worst part is, if they're not the issuer, one of the bad answers you get to is actually they're an affiliated person, and so they have selling restrictions. And so it's like, oh, if one of the entities your issuer, you're golden because you can rely, if as long as it's in the US, you can rely on this, you can rely on this securities exemption. And if it's not in the if that's not the issuer, then you've actually like maybe end up trapping value in an entity that's not allowed to sell, which I mean,
like that would just be crazy. Like they've got to fix that.
I think
Right?
that can't be the right answer, but it is something that like I'm concerned about in the like if we're starting from scratch, clean build, easy to structure things so that we know which entity is the issuer, and we do that very intentionally. But that's like the biggest thing that is just like the gating item when we start looking at these gating transaction, is like, which entity is the issuer? Which entity would we like to be the issuer? How can we get to a higher degree of certainty that the entity that we want to be the issuer and is appropriately thought of as the issuer will actually be treated that way? So like those are the kinds of niche, those are the kind of like technical questions that we're going to have to wait until we see what the language is that actually passes, because like a very small tweak to a definition could completely change the way we think about that. And I think and this is the big transition for the industry in terms of legal advice and having law that actually applies to what we're doing, right? Because I think like up until this point, so much of being in the crypto practice as a lawyer and giving advice to clients has been, let's use an analogy to what happens when you're talking about some other financial instrument or some commodity or some security, or like, what's the law that might apply here? And then we think about policy and we think about case law, and we come up with an argument that's like, here's something that you could defend in court if you had to. And we're going to be moving from that to a world where there's actually words on paper that was passed as an act of Congress, and those words are what applies. and that's like, it's going to be different for us as lawyers in this industry, but it's going to be we're used to that in other contexts, but it's going to be very different, I think, for our clients who are used to hearing an answer that might have more wiggle room, frankly, because it's based on policy, to this is what it says on the page, and if we don't like it, we're actually going to have to reach out to a regulator and ask for relief because it's a brand new law. It's got the authority of Congress. Like if someone's looking at this, they're just going to read the law and apply it the way it was written, and they may look to some intent. But there's also like great room for locating those things because then the regulators are going to be passing clarifying regulations. And so it's like a great time to engage too, to be like,
Yeah.
hey, we tried to structure our activities under this act and we found this like ambiguity that's going to make it really hard. Congress didn't intend to make it really hard. They wanted us to be doing this in the US. Like, let's call the SEC and get some guidance. And like that's just like a whole new type of engagement than this industry has ever been able to do before. And it's exciting, but it's going to feel different. It's going to feel real different.
Yeah. I would, maybe this is too wonky, so pull me out of the weeds as needed, but you've described this world that we as crypto legal practitioners have just literally never lived in, and this is like over a decade now. Take us back, if possible, all of you guys, to if you were Satoshi literally launching Bitcoin. I was just thinking through like the multiple issuers like thing that you just raised, Chad. Like, couldn't there be multiple issuers in the sense of like big miners or something like that, like in the beginning, or is it just Satoshi, or how would that work?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think one of the things that the act is really structured around is the idea that people are going, like, there's this people selling tokens for capital raising purposes. And there is an attempt to carve out, things that, distributions to end users that, distributions to end users and, and which maybe would be mining in that context, and like also like there was no pre-sale, right? There's now if you're in a world where you're now there's a question you can sort of ask the question of like how far away from those facts do you have to be? Like if you've got a group of people who are under common control and they're the ones who are doing the initial mining and then they're selling, like those are the kinds of like cases I imagine we would see brought under this act in the future where like something like that happened and the dispute is like, was that an end user distribution or were those people under common control and that was some kind of underwriting or they were agents of the issuer? But yeah, I mean, I think I think there is room for something that looks like a fair launch or something like that, but like and we certainly could advise, like that would be super exciting and interesting to advise on. But really the purpose, like I think the clarity, if anything, I think it's an acknowledgement that like Bitcoin, who knows if that could ever happen again, given the world that we have today. But like everything that's happened since has entailed some degree of capital raising around
Like literally like Ethereum.
Designed not to be a security, right? Like Ethereum is
the the statute is almost designed to give the Ethereum team clarity.
I think a good way to think of it is like how can we make how can we make what the origin story of Ethereum work under the under the law, yeah. Given like the extraordinary level of value creation there, right? Like I mean, just like cost benefit analysis for society, I think it's pretty clear that that was like a good thing that it happened. It should be something that people can try and replicate, right?
Right.
Yeah.
We had a question. Sean, did you want to I think we at least have one question. Yeah.
Yeah. So the question was just, will 1099s be required for airdrops? And I'll very quickly say this. The 1099 obligation isn't contingent upon what entity it is. Any business entity is required to file 1099s as required. As to whether they're specifically required and whether 1099 is specifically required, it depends on the facts and what's being airdropped. If it's a grant-like thing to U.S. persons, 1099s are probably over $600, which could increase. I know that's been floated in bills. That's numbers could go up. 1099s are probably required. But again, any company that's doing airdrops out of the U.S. would need to work with their accountants and tax specialists and tax attorneys to make sure they're meeting their 1099 obligations and everything. And that's why it's like when you start doing this in the U.S., part of what you're going to have to do is doing the things that any U.S. company that's dealing in financial markets has to do. learning how to deal with these types of returns and these types of programs. So
honestly, like in my mind, I'm like, if the 1090, if the 1099 thing continues to be fuzzy, and everybody had wanted to do ICOs anyway, and let's say meeting the safe harbor is as reasonable as we all hope it is going to be, then maybe I don't know, it's like a weird thing where like maybe airdrops become much smaller than what we've seen over the past 5 years.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to depend on the project, right? Like there are going to be projects where they need that to kickstart the flywheel, right? Like they need to have a wide user distribution in order for their model to work, right? And an airdrop is still going to be the appropriate response for those projects, right? As opposed to projects that don't need wide distribution among their user base right off the bat, and maybe, instead need capital and want to do more of a capital raising transaction.
Particularly in like a vampire attack type scenario, which is like, I'm probably not going to go away from crypto. I agree, Rebecca. Yeah, for sure.
But also, I mean, a vampire attack, but also I'm thinking, I'm like back to Munchies, right? Like if you're trying to create a project where the whole idea is that like the way that the system works is a lot of people are transacting in these microtransactions in the token, and that's what's creating the value in the overall system. Like you have to start with people having the token. Like you have to get the user.
But wouldn't Munchies just be vampire attacking Yelp? That's what I'm proposing.
Maybe we're saying the same thing. Yeah, fair enough.
Just don't want to miss something Sean said, which I think is a really important, it kind of comes up with this 1099 thing, is like, I think in our experience structuring like US based projects, many a times we hear we're fine paying US tax, but the reporting obligations become unworkable. Like the reporting obligations actually are what would kill the possibility. And so, I mean, I don't know, Sean, if you want to say anything more nuanced there, but like that's, I know, something we've talked a lot about with Dunas, where it's like, oh, this needs to not, like all of these things need to not be reportable transactions, or it's just not possible because no one's going to have the information they need to report.
I'm glad you raised that. Yeah, Sean, dude, can you please help us? Can you please help Sean, like tax not kill our Dunas, man?
No, I mean, thanks, Chris. I think Chad hit spot on. I mean, like if you're engaged in a US thing and you're doing this, you're going to have to know who the people you're airdropping it to and go through that tax collection part. I mean, that is a requirement. That's going to be something that the IRS is going to mandate. If you're doing that, you're going to have to know who your counterparties are, at least over a certain de minimis amount. And that's going to be something that navigating. Now, the Duna structure gives you a clear US entity which can make those reportings and make those filings. I know that's been a point that's been made by many proponents of it, that you have the entity that can do that work and that can collect that work, but that is going to be difficult. I mean, we saw that the potential disastrous consequences of the DeFi regs, which were withdrawn by Congress, but now even just kind of the more general reporting 1099 things can give rise to that, and can give rise to a need to collect that information, and that's a consideration that I totally understand projects are going to make as they make a decision whether or not to operate out of the US.
Can I make a slightly orthogonal point though also, which is that like one of the things that we've talked about under the Clarity Act, not on this webinar, but kind of in the broader conversations that we're having back at home without our audience, is that complying with this safe harbor is also going to require a ton of paperwork, right? Like it has filing requirements, it has information provision requirements. Like this is not going to be a, hey, like we just meet these requirements, we do the thing, and then like maybe we litigate it later. Like you have to make affirmative SEC requirements like initially and then every 6 months, right? That have a huge amount of information in them. And so another kind of transformation that we're going to see in the industry, right, is that we all joke like we're accidentally going to become cap markets attorneys, right? Like, oh, we're going to be like over there with all of our colleagues at Fenwick who are helping folks put together their SEC filings. Like that's going to be what we're doing next. And so I think it's, it isn't the case that, we're going to get clarity and everything's just going to be like as it was. But now we know it's fine. It's actually, there's going to be some like fundamental changes in, the way things are structured, the requirements that folks have to comply with, the legal costs, the paperwork costs, the compliance costs, and all of that as well.
All right, let's end on a high note. I think maybe part 2 of this is like, what do we do? Because now like the waiting game is on, like people are writing articles, we're all like, we're there, we've got the legislation, but like the legislation isn't here. And I've recently heard Chad say some really dispiriting things about how long it might take. So maybe part 2 is like, what do we do while we wait? Thank you all for joining. If there's any final questions, happy to field them. We'll keep an eye out for like another 10 seconds or so, but any final thoughts from you guys? Can it be a hopeful note though? Like just hopeful, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like, it's really exciting. We've had like the world that we've been living in has been a world where the folks who are building in this industry are people who are comfortable with a huge amount of legal uncertainty and regulatory uncertainty. Love you guys. Like, thank you for carrying the water. But like now things are going to open up, right? And we're going to have a lot more companies that require this type of certainty or that need this type of certainty, or don't have that type of risk appetite, feeling more comfortable playing in the space, right? And I think we're already starting to see that, even before the bills pass, that folks are getting more interested in restarting projects that have been long dormant and kind of, jumping back in. And so it's like, hey, we're really going to take over the world, guys. Like, this is fantastic.
Thank you for Rebecca. No, Sean. No, I said hopeful. We have to end. We have to end, dude. Okay, okay for Sean. Fine.
Let me say the positive thing. To the point of what Rebecca said on this, being a crypto attorney right now is a lot like being a securities attorney in the 1920s, where you are dealing with a new kind of market in stock, which then was seen as very different in publicly traded stock. There wasn't organized ways of thinking about it. And we have an opportunity to help craft what things are. And I think the Web3 attorneys are going to look like probably securities attorney, probably look like public capital markets attorneys today in 75 years. But we kind of get to be on the ground and do it. So it's an optimistic note, Chris, to end on.
Thank you, Sean.
Completely in support of Rebecca's point.
Appreciate you channeling that. All right, guys. Thank you, everybody. Toodles. Till next time.